This segment is talking about international procurement. And I believe, we all, the title of that is self-explanatory, really. And what I will also start by saying is every one of the concepts that my co-panelist has presented today absolutely applies when we're looking internationally for goods and services. But before I start, I want to kind of, take us a little step prior to say, when we start thinking of international procurement, the very first thing we need to look at is international procurement actually the way to go? That's the very first question. Are there local suppliers, local providers that can provide the good or service that we're looking for, either in full or even partially? And I think to remain true to the vision, the aims of ActionAid and of CIPS in promoting supply chain development around the world, this absolutely needs to be a core thing. We can't preach one thing and then when it's time to procure, we do something else. So I think this is the very first place. And in addition to sort of that ideological advantage, there are commercial and social benefits of going with local suppliers. They could include better pricing due to some lower costs, like transportation and some overheads as well. Lead times, I think we saw over the period of the pandemic that locally available goods were more reliable, quicker to deliver compared to anything that was being shipped because of travel bans and shipping delays. Carbon footprint, that's something increasingly we should all be concerned about. So flying things around the world obviously is more harmful than looking locally. And also just the social benefit of creating jobs and livelihoods from local employment and buying from local small and medium-sized enterprises. So for these reasons, it is also beneficial to look locally first. And if the situation comes where either local suppliers cannot be found, or it's found that it's actually not commercially or socially beneficial to go local, in the example of I think Newton gave earlier of buying trucks from South Africa, you might say, okay, given the time we're dealing with, there's not much advantage of us looking for this locally because we know that there's no existing base and it's kind of much quicker, much more beneficial to get it externally. Even if international procurement is the solution, we need to go back and think of how do we make the international procurement work for the local suppliers, local value chain, local people. If international procurement is the solution, we need to go back and think of how do we make the international procurement work for the local suppliers, local value chain, local people. And some of the things that we can think of as procurement professionals is looking at, do our contract terms promote technology transfer, capacity development, employment, and investments from the international suppliers to the local economy? So you might well hire an international supplier, but are they able to employ local workforce, for example? That's a benefit. Or you might well hire an international company. Do they partner with any local company to deliver goods? And is there a way to write into their contract a requirement for them to develop or train or hand over knowledge to their local partner? Supplier development programs are also, a big thing. I think we've seen programs around training, capacity development delivered by all sorts of stakeholders, from government to donors and so on. As procurement teams, again, we can think of how are we promoting this? How are we increasing the connections, perhaps within our local supply base and these sorts of programs? The other thing that could work is looking at the concept of unbundling scopes of work and how that fosters local international partnerships. What I mean by unbundling or bundling is sometimes when we list our tenders, we have a collection of goods and services in a single tender. Sometimes a local supplier might not be able to supply all of that, but they might be able to supply a particular portion of that scope. So we should be considering, actually, can I separate an item and tender it, separately to encourage local suppliers to be able to bid, rather than putting it in a big contract where only international suppliers have the capacity to fulfill everything. So that being said, I just really wanted to start here to say we shouldn't always jump into international procurement. And even when we have to do that, we need to be thinking of what is the pathway to increasing the linkages and the benefits to my local economy. That should be at the core of what we are doing. And then to handle the rest of the my time, I wanted to focus on those specific issues that were raised in the pre-workshop survey. And the reason for that, as I said, I believe Ronald and Sandra have very well covered a lot of the procurement basic, foundational concepts. So I wanted to handle those specific topics and just provide some general guidance and advice on those. So there were four main issues. The first one was supplier selection. So how do we identify reliable, competitive suppliers? And I think earlier on it was raised also by Newton that sometimes there is such an issue in finding suppliers in the first place because they don't respond in a traditional way to procurement tenders and so on. So how do we go about identifying good suppliers? And of course, in emergencies, it's even more difficult. The second thing is looking at logistics best practices. There was a question around how to navigate transportation, import regulations as well. International procure-to-pay processes, so looking at the whole life cycle, including especially the financing and invoice side of things. And then the final area that was raised was around supplier performance. So how to deal with poor performance, especially when it touches on international suppliers. So on the first issue of supplier selection, I just have a few tips here. The first one is linked again to some of our earlier presentations, is about starting early. So it's extremely essential to start early, to plan ahead, to know, okay, what are the goods and services I expect to procure in the next 1 year, 2 years, and begin to expand the search. So you might find that, it's supply registration portals, which are increasing in use, actually, that are a good place to check for potential suppliers of certain categories. You might find that networking with other buyers, will result in some discovery of some new sort of supply mechanisms for you. You might even find other methods like social media or things like LinkedIn are a good place to check for potential suppliers. So I would just encourage that as early as possible, as early as it is possible for you to start thinking of your supply list, your long list, that will, to set you up for success later, because you can then go through thorough processes to vet and to ask all the right questions before getting in bed with any supplier. It will also increase your chances of actually finding a supplier in the first place. The other thing that, in your selection process to think about is the vetting process that you go through. So depending on the criticality of the goods and services that you're buying, it's important to go through a very structured process of looking beyond cost when selecting suppliers. So you can look at things like their technical capability, their financial stability, sustainability issues as well. How ethical are they? Do they use modern slavery? Do they use child labor, for example? So asking the right questions to come up with a view on how suitable a particular supplier is for working with your team. And I've included here a link to, there's a bank, a question bank that has some good questions that we can ask suppliers when vetting them, when screening them, to see if they're potential good partners to work with. The other thing that I would also recommend is especially when we deal in perhaps less formal, less developed economies. Sometimes even establishing the legitimacy of a business we're dealing with is a challenge. So for that, I would say definitely rely on publicly available databases in the country's company registration sites. There are some countries that have them electronically. So by all means, go and check, is this company legitimate? Who are their directors, and so on, so that you know who you are working with and you're less prone to people that are looking to exploit. It is way more difficult to understand sort of a whole international landscape if we don't rely on these sorts of tools and databases to help us screen. And then the final thing, which was one of Roland's last point, is when we're looking at suppliers, to become a more attractive buying organization, looking for ways to increase your bargaining power is a very good idea. So looking at things like consortium buying, pooling your demand with other buyers is a very good way to increase the attractiveness of your business and therefore attract better suppliers. So if you're able to do that on things that you're not competing on with some of other buying organizations, that will be extremely beneficial and might also help to reduce buying transaction costs as well, because they will be shared. The next issue of logistics best practices that was raised, we know there's a lot of dynamism, a lot of risk associated with shipping goods and services into and out of country. So the first thing is to understand really what are the risks involved, and then from there, who is best placed to manage those risks. Is it you, the buyer? Is it the supplier? Is it a third party like a shipping company? And once you understand that, you can then write contracts that are fit for purpose, including Incoterms, which are sort of international commerce terms that identify at what point in the transportation process responsibility transfers from buyer to seller. And this really helps because it makes it very straightforward to identify, okay, who is responsible for shipping the items, who is responsible for insuring the items, who is responsible for clearing them through customs and so on. If you find that you're in a position where maybe your organization is not maybe well equipped, or you don't have a huge knowledge around the way these logistics processes work, you might choose an Incoterm that puts more of that responsibility on the supplying organization. So that way your supplier can be responsible for delivering those items to your doorstep. And that way you choose something like an FCA Incoterm. But I'm sorry, not FCA, you choose something like a delivery DDP, delivered duty paid Incoterm, or something like that. If the opposite is the case and you're working with a supplier where perhaps you have more of control, more networks, more understanding of logistics, perhaps better costs as well, you might choose an FCA Incoterm where you pick up the items from your supplier's premises and you handle the shipping and customs clearance. The important thing here is just to define who is doing what and make that decision based on who is best placed to manage those risks and perhaps who has more favorable terms of doing that. And if the responsibility falls on you, you could also transfer to a third-party professional company that is used to doing this day in, day out to help with that process. So that would be my recommendation. Always, seek to increase information, work with professionals, people that are used to dealing with this in order to navigate better. And customs is ever changing, ever complex. So it's really important to do things the right way to avoid negative repercussions or delays for your company. And then the third thing that was listed was international procure to pay, so especially to do with financing and invoicing. First thing here is to make sure that the charges, the jurisdictions, the countries that you're dealing with are clarified prior to agreeing a final price with your supplier, because these things can impact prices very heavily, especially taxes. So it's and they can impact delivery dates as well, your lead time. So it's really important to make sure that those are defined before you've agreed and shaken your supplier's hand on a price. And then as you do that, ensure that you are involving your finance teams and your tax teams, because they will have the insight and some of the expertise that you need to make right decisions and come up with the right agreement with your supplier. And also note that the longer the term of your contract, the higher the risk that you bear in this area. So if a contract is for, very short term, your risk is managed, right? Because you probably have a viewpoint to what's going to happen in the next 1 month. But, if it's 2 years, you have an agreement with the supplier, it's maybe not advisable to sign up to a fixed term, sign up to fixed agreements that cover the entirety of that time without having a proper think of those things that could change and could move. And it's important to keep scanning the environment, keep learning, and keep improving constantly. And one thing I would also flag here is, as you figure out your taxes, your finance processes, invoicing as well, be really careful about where you are giving advice to your suppliers. It is advisable not to do this, because you don't want to advise them and then something changes down the line and they come back to you to say, well, you're the person that told us this. Advise your suppliers to get their own professional advice based on the country they're based in, based on their industry as well, because these things change, they change quite often. And then the final area is around supplier performance and how to manage suppliers that are not in your same jurisdiction. The key thing here is the proactivity and planning. Good supplier performance starts with picking the right supplier in the first place. So we've gone through some tips for picking right suppliers, identifying them, but it's really important to get this step right to even have any decent delivery. The other things that we need to do is to make sure that the contracts that we use are very clear on what is required and what is material to delivery. And CIPS have some really good model contracts that can be used that have some good sections that identify things like what happens in disputes, what happens, remedy of defects, and so on. So I would advise that you go and check out a model contract to make sure that the templates that you're using are fit for purpose. And then the use of bonuses or gain sharing could also be a good incentive for good performance, because suppliers will be more likely to deliver if they know that perhaps they have a financial incentive if they deliver on time or they deliver good quality. And then finally, well-structured payments milestones can be an incentive as well, because obviously, if you pay all the money up front, your supplier might become complacent. But if you structure your timetabling, you will be able to sort of hold them to that, because there's still something at stake.
We need to take into consideration what type of buy we have. A new buy, the procurement process needs to start early to allow enough time to carry out the market research and due diligence. For rebuys, we can use pre-qualified suppliers, since this might be something that was previously procured. Thank you for that, Mary. And then Catherine, I think your comment feeds in nicely with my question. Was Zimbabwe, we have Buy Zimbabwe concept that encourages buying Zimbabwean supplies. Similarly, in South Africa, we have Proudly South Africa, etc. And I think these are mechanisms to stimulate local economies and ensure employment rather than spending the money across our borders. So how would we navigate through that? Maybe Mobala and Ronald, and we'll conclude thereafter.
Can I go?
Yeah.
Okay. No, thank you so much. Yeah. I think those are some of the aspects, particularly on that question, that constitute the hidden cost in international procurement. Where the local government, usually they classify some of these tariffs with those items that they strongly believe are Okay, let's share with those items that they strongly believe are locally available in country. They put higher tariffs to kind of discourage importation. So what I would suggest in this instance, you need to do your costing, your procurement decision, your landed cost, your expected landed cost against your local price. Because in as much as the foreign price would be less than the local price, there are a lot of costs that you pick, particularly the costs around the tariffs, because there are tariffs embargoes. So, and also work with your local office in terms of your, in South Africa, we talk of trade, it's the trade office, basically, that deals with importation. So just seek clarity from them, which of these commodities that are classified with a higher tariff, and what is that tariff? Then from there, you make an informed decision, and also check the in-country regulations and policies in terms of economic development, because that is going to guide you in terms of that decision upfront. And obviously the issue of long lead times, because there are these approvals, the goods are subject to maybe physical examination at the port of entry or the port of exit. So check those aspects before you undertake your procurement decision. Thank you.
Thanks, Ronald. Mobala, in conclusion, can you add something?
In conclusion, I would say on that point in particular, just important to understand what are the drivers for your country. So some governments do have policies in place that mandate minimum thresholds of certain goods and services. So important to keep abreast of that, keep updated on that as a procurement team. That it's procurement responsibility, local content. So that will inform your procurement strategies and everything else that follows on.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, bang on time. I think that brings us to the end of today's discussion. I just want to thank the delegates for attending, ActionAid, the panelists, and the teams from the UK for making the time available today. It does feel that we can speak the entire day on these topics, and appreciate all the insights from everyone. And I think it's really practical and relevant insights we shared today. I think Newton mentioned this at the start. This dialogue and idea exchange is very key to solidify our approach for this initiative, and it certainly must continue. And we must keep the conversation alive and expand the network. So thank you. I think maybe I'll just hand over quickly to Newton to also say a parting shot, and we will then conclude. I'm sure the recording will be made available as well. So over to you, Newton. I can still see Newton online. There we go.
Thanks a lot, Hemant, and just thanks a lot to the panels as well. I think we really had exciting and insightful discussions there, pointed to a lot of issues, challenged us to think differently, challenged us to also see how broad procurement is. And thank you so much to our panel there, CIPS Foundation International, everyone. I see Mobala, Ronald, Sandra, Joanne is there, Maggie, Millie, Nikki, all of you guys, thank you so much. I think this was very insightful and a lot for us to learn and to take note of. And also just to thank the participants as well. I had earlier highlighted that we have all our partners in the Value Project, and we had Mercy Corps here represented by Selina, COSIF by Reginald, Mitchview by Phineas Agonda. We also had Esther representing Bradford. We had ActionAid Zimbabwe. We had Eli, Mary, Garisai, We also had Tanatswa as well, Catherine and Zante, all of these participating. And I think it was really great, colleagues. And I think this is the beginning of more platforms like this. We certainly do look forward to more engagements where we can touch base and update ourselves in terms of what is happening in the broader procurement world as well. So I see there's also been a link that has been shared for us to complete a survey there. So I would really appeal to the participants from all over to ensure that at least please do complete your survey. I think that's the best way in which your feedback can also be conveyed, so that at least in terms of the future proceedings, we are able to actually improve in terms of the organization of such meetings. So I think from my side, thanks a lot once more, colleagues. This is a very important element of our project. And I remember when this project started, when we were also doing the risk analysis and risk mapping, part of what we were really noticing as the key risks of a project were around procurement, because we're having to move more than $3 million on literally procurements. And I think such guidance is very important, so that at least we remain in compliant parameters. Under the EU funding, I think they are also very sensitive around procurement as well. They always talk about ineligible costs. And whenever you at times do procure, not following internal procedures laid up, that's all qualified as an ineligible cost, which you as an institution have to bear at the end of the day. So with such sessions like this, taking some of this information, influencing how things are done in our organizations, I think puts us in a position of advantage, better compliance, minimizing risks that expose our institutions. I know a number of institutions that have actually closed down because of some procurement sagas as well. But I think with this type of knowledge, receiving it from you, beefing it up as well in terms of our internal systems, I think it puts us into the rightful position.